Hello there and welcome to The Brief. It's Tuesday's edition. I'm Jessy Chahal. Well, joining me shortly is Crisis Management Analyst Nordin Abdullah. He will walk us through food security and safety in line with this year's World Consumer Rights Day. And later, I speak to MOHIDEEN Abdul President of the Consumer Association of Penang, to give us some of his input. Well, as usual, we first dive into what's happening in and around the country. Here's the news in brief. At the Parliament, the Ministry of Finance, Bank Negara, and the Securities Commission are all collaborating with relevant agencies to formulate a comprehensive legal framework to regulate all consumer credit activities, including the scheme that is called Buy Now and Pay Later. According to the Deputy Finance Minister, the framework would be formulated through the enactment of the Consumer Credit Act this year. Well, still at the Parliament, the government will review several policies to ensure the country's food supply chain is not affected by the Ukraine-Russia crisis. According to the Agriculture and Food Industry Minister, this initiative is vital in reducing the country's dependency on imported resources. On to the political focus of the week. UMNO will need to resolve potential internal issues if there happens to be a clash of views on the Johor Menteri Besar candidacy following Saturday's state election. Now, according to a political analyst from USM, throughout the election campaign, only Johor's Barisan Nasional Chairman, Datuk Seri Hasni Mohamad, was mentioned as the coalition's choice for the post of Menteri Besar. Meanwhile, UMNO's election performance and Barisan Nasional, as well as the direction of Mufakat Nasional, pioneered with PAS, will all be hot topics at the UMNO 2021 General Assembly, which begins tomorrow. The assembly will be a face-to-face, like it has been in the old days. It will be the most important platform of the largest Malay political party to strategize for the 15th general election. And despite various challenges, implementation of Phase 1 of Jendela, or the National Digital Network Plan 2020-2022 in Sarawak, remains on schedule. According to MCMC's Sarawak Director, Adiman Ajim, the implementation aims to spur the state's aspirations of achieving the developed status by year 2030. Phase 1 of Jendela is to expand and improve broadband services. This is also to prep for the transition from 4G to 5G technology. Well, it is World Consumerism Day, and for my discussion today, I'd like to bring in Nordin Abdullah for him to walk us through food security and safety issues around. Come back on board. It was good to chat to you in yesterday's edition as well. But today we zoom into consumerism. This is a word that is wrapped around each and every one of us at many levels, right? We are consumers ourselves. When we look at consumerism and how this has evolved as well, we see the need to improve food safety at a higher level for food security. Now, how does this, Nordin, impact the economy? Why is it a potential slow burn crisis?
Well, Jesse, one of the things when we look about food safety before we talk about food security, and especially how it impacts consumers, we've seen some very interesting data recently during COVID-19 lockdowns. Food poisoning cases dropped dramatically. And usually food safety issues and food poisoning is related to lost man days in terms of productivity. So when we talk about a slow burn crisis, we often talk about a crisis that is bubbling away or burning, smoldering there on an ongoing basis. And you don't realize that all of a sudden it eats into $1, $2, $3 billion worth of GDP production. So one of the things that we look at now is how Malaysians are now becoming more aware of food safety and improving the supply chain to ensure that the food is healthy and clean, so that the consumers are able to remain healthy, to be able to produce. And this is a very simple thing where previously we're just like, makan apa-apa pun boleh. But now it's all about ensuring that consumers are safe. And the strategic imperative is because if they're not safe, they get sick. If they get sick, they can't produce. If you can't produce, you don't have an economy working at full potential. And that is the slow burn crisis that we're concerned about.
I want to go back to what you said about apa-apa pun boleh. And so another area of concern is fake products and knockoffs. Why is this another problem that we need to address as a nation in terms of consumerism and consumer rights?
Well, one of the things we're seeing the most data coming out here is in the luxury goods sector. The luxury handbags, luxury products. Now, a lot of those brands are global in essence, and they are now looking at which countries are able to protect their brands. And it becomes a very important area of domestic trade. And again, it goes back to consumerism, that those supply chains are kept intact. And things like product piracy and the knockoff are not available in the country. Why? Because the agencies involved are doing the proper enforcement. Now, when that happens, these global brands, of course, they have a rating system, and globally they look at which countries get it right and which don't. It all flows back into their decision-making matrix. When you start to get it right as a country, people realize and investors realize that it's a safe place to do commercial business, and we'll see. And we see in Malaysia massive amounts of high-end products available in all the top shopping centers. Now, why is that the case? It's because there's a huge consumer demand for it, but at the same time, the government continues to protect and has done so over the last 5 to 10 years to ensure that consumers are protected, both at the high-end product market as well as looking at the food stuff. So it's an ongoing process.
That's right, an ongoing and important process as well. Now, let's look at NGOs in this point. NGOs, of course, play an important role, but they're also fake NGOs, and that obviously has impacted the development of consumerism in the country. What are some of the threats, Nordin, of following the advice of unregistered NGOs in this context? NGOs who thrive on providing guidance and advocacy and advice to unassuming consumers.
Exactly, Jessy. And we've seen over the last 10, 20 years, even in Malaysia, some of the NGOs, and we talk about fake NGOs. We talk about fake NGOs are those who are not registered properly with the Registrar of Societies, but still put out as if they are registered. And of course, it's against the Act. But what happens is they're part of what we see as often a crisis point, which creates crisis for companies that are producing quality product, and then they will make an allegation against that company, and then the company wants to take action against them. But who do you take action against? Because they're not actually registered. So this is one area. Of course, sometimes the media also pick up and say, "Oh, this particular NGO or a group of NGOs has said something," but the reality is they're not registered in many cases. So there's also a role for the media to play to get it right in terms of the reporting. So we're looking at the entire ecosystem of consumerism that NGOs play a part, the government play a part, the corporate sector play a part, and all for the benefit of consumers. And that's what it should be about.
That's right. I think you've pointed out and underscored, a really important point here, that the role of the media doesn't just end at certain boundaries. It's continuous, it's almost borderless, and it's so important in so many different platforms and elements. Nordin, we'll speak to you again tomorrow as we check in with you with more crisis-related topics. Till then, do take care. That was Nordin Abdullah, our crisis management analyst, weighing in a little bit on, of course, consumerism. It is a World Consumer Rights Day. Well, moving into business in brief right now, the ringgit opened slightly weaker against the US dollar after the latest strong economic data. This is amidst rising pressures suggesting that the Federal Reserve is on track to gradually remove the monetary policy accommodation. As of this morning, $1 is currently 4 ringgit 20 cents. And at the Bursa Malaysia has remained low as profit taking continued in most indices led by the technology and the oil and gas counters. At 12:30 p.m., slightly earlier, the benchmark FBM KLCI was 0.45% at 1560.27. And as we move on in gold very quickly, today's gold price is 254 ringgit and 40 cent per gram. In other economic stories, short-term rates are expected to remain stable today on Bank Negara's operations to absorb surplus liquidity from the financial system. Liquidity is expected or estimated at 48.94 billion ringgit in the conventional system and 19.70 billion in Islamic funds. And as we move on, let's get into the international business headlines. The social media giant Meta Platforms Incorporated, formerly known as Facebook, is facing prosecution in South Africa for unfairly trying to block local startups from using its WhatsApp business application programming interface, or better known as API. Now, the company is apparently abusing market dominance. It's time to bring in our feature guest for today in conjunction with World Consumer Rights Day. MOHIDEEN Abdullah, President of the Consumer Association of Penang, joins me at this moment in time. Welcome, MOHIDEEN, to the brief. Thanks for being with us. It is, of course, World Consumer Rights Day. It's celebrated March 15th every year. It's a global event as well that aims to raise awareness about consumer rights and needs. Of course, consumer rights means that every person who buys any kind of product or good or services has the right to have information on its quality, its purity, its standard, all those products being purchased. And as a consumer, did you know that you have the right to file a complaint from anywhere, anytime as well? Unfortunately, most people are not aware of their rights as consumers. Lucky for us, MOHIDEEN joins us at this point of time. This year's theme is fair digital finance. So important now as we are on the cusp of, getting many businesses and, of course, e-commerce platforms as well sort of on the rise here. There's a lot of uptake. But having said all of that, online transactions are seeing more scams and so on and so forth. What do we need to know at this point about the landscape of some of these consumer issues versus the theme that is this year, MOHIDEEN?
Thank you, Jessy. First of all, let me say about World Consumer Rights Day. We celebrate this day to make consumers aware of their rights as well as their responsibilities. And now, currently, the situation is, as you have posed, the digital age, where people are being pushed to adopt digital means in their financial transactions. We have to be very careful.
I've got a small request. If you could just speak up a little bit. We have your voice in the distance there.
We have to be
Yes.
very careful about digital finance. First of all, there are millions of people, consumers, who are not very familiar with this new technology. And they have to be taken into account in implementing digitalization of our finance system. Secondly, there is a lot of abuse of the digital system. For example, in the first half of 2019, 23 million stolen credit cards appeared in the dark web, and these are purchased by people using, and they use them to siphon away money that belongs to the consumer. So, and also there is a statistics like 200,000 attacks. There have been 200,000 attacks on retail shops, stores. So all these will have an impact on the prices they pay consumers pay for their products and services.
Right.
So
I
we
have some
should
stats
be,
here that I wanted to share as well. In the parliament yesterday, in fact, we heard that there were about 52,000 online fraud cases alone, with more than 1.61 billion ringgit in losses. That's
yes.
reported from the year 2019 up till last year. This is the highest in terms of, some of the online purchases that's been closely followed by non-existent known cases. So this number is, of course, a huge number and is as you've pointed out as well, equally worrying. If I could just take you through the next point of discussion here as well, with the conflict between Russia and Ukraine, plus what we're seeing with, of course, the pandemic now, oil prices are going through the roof as well. What are you reading as to how this ripple effects will hit the region, of course, Malaysia?
It will have a serious, disastrous impact on the cost of living of most people. Prices will go up. We have already seen prices of food, prices of goods have already shot up. The war, the war in Ukraine, if it doesn't get resolved within a week or two, with the talks going on between the parties, the oil prices, as you have said, will skyrocket, and energy is the source of almost all commercial transactions. So inevitably, prices will go up. What we need to do is, how do we tackle this situation? We hope that it will be a short term. If the war in Ukraine ends, then the prices or price of oil will stabilize and may even come very low. We have seen oil prices as low as 50, 60 US dollars a barrel. So, given the move by the international community in the various climate conferences, with the commitment of many countries, including oil producing countries, to ultimately do away with oil, then the issue of oil dictating price changes will disappear. But in the meantime, in Malaysia, we're also producing oil, but we are also consuming imported oil. So the government has to manage the money we earn from oil properly, set up a fund for future generations so that oil is an depleting resource. It's not going to
Right.
be there forever. We
True.
need to.
I mean, in terms of oil prices as well, in the region, Malaysia is one of the lowest, and how that has been priced. As we move from the pandemic, moving into an endemic phase, as we know, that is something that is just, about to happen as well. How have supply chains evolved? Where do we see it heading? I mean, if we look back in the thick of the MCO, of course, supply chains were halted, they were interrupted. That has caused much stumbling issues for a lot of businesses as well. So at this point of time, as we move towards some progress, how do we see all of this changing?
I think we need two things. With the pandemic evolving to endemic, we should improve our trade relations with our neighboring countries, with ASEAN countries. And we should try to import and export between ASEAN countries as much as possible and try to reduce our dependence on Europe and US and other countries. That's one. Secondly, this also forces us to think, how are we investing? We need to invest more money in agriculture, and so that we will attain sufficient food security. Currently, we are importing a great deal of food from outside. Even the onions, we are importing from Holland, and yet we are not able to produce our own onions. Similarly, for meat, most of the meat is imported from overseas. Yet we have been talking about building a cattle industry and a meat industry. We have not gone very far in that direction. There have
Right.
been some scandalous uh, investments in this area, but this is where I think the government should re, relook at its investment policy and not just focus on attracting foreign direct investment. And
With
just, just,
scandals and scams, it is
just
World Consumer Rights Day. If I can very quickly have you answer this last question before we wrap up, as time is of essence here. What is your message, Nordin, to the World Consumer Day? I mean, in conjunction with that, to
my
Malaysians nationwide.
CAP's message is, as it has been in every year, that people must be careful in managing their funds. First of all, they must live simply and within means and not spend their money in wasteful consumption. Secondly, they must be also responsible consumers. In other words, whatever they consume should not have serious adverse impacts on the environment. So use less energy, less water, don't throw away, try to recycle and reuse. This is our message to the consumers, to the people of Malaysia. And be self-reliant.
I think that those are wonderful and such important reminders as well, as we observe World Consumer Rights Day. Once again, all of us are a consumer, and it's important to be aware and educated about the rights that we have. Nordin, thank you very much for your time, and we
Thank you,
hope
Jessy.
to speak to you soon as well. We move on to the international news segment at this point of time. At the Ukraine crisis, satellite imagery shows extensive damage to the port of Mariupol, home to the worst humanitarian crisis of the Ukraine conflict. Now, Russian forces led a first column of cars escape but blocked an aid convoy trying to reach the city. This is after 10 days of failed attempts for Ukraine to rescue civilians under relentless bombardment. And in the meantime, pay attention to this. Yesterday, the UN Secretary General sounded the alarm over Russia, raising the alert level for its nuclear forces. Putin announced last month that his nuclear forces should be put on high alert, raising fears that Russia's invasion of Ukraine could lead to a nuclear war. In the meantime, the US believes they have seen no reason to change its nuclear alert levels. And here's a development on the MH17 case. Dutch Foreign Minister has announced legal action to hold Russia accountable for the downing of the Malaysia Airlines flight MH17. The Netherlands and Australia jointly announced legal action against Russia under international law with full reparations for the injuries caused for their nationals on board. Meanwhile, Russia has continued to deny any involvement with a range of alternative theories, which international investigators have rejected for the lack of evidence. And from that, we move into some news of the coronavirus. France has lifted most COVID 19 restrictions beginning this week, ending the mandatory mask wearing in most public places and allowing the unvaccinated back into social. Well, this move comes less than a month before the presidential elections, and just as the number of cases trends upwards again, with scientists questioning it being a premature easing. France's vaccine pass rules fueled weeks of street protests when they were first announced. And on to sports headlines. Daniel Medvedev has lost his world number one ranking after being defeated by Gael Monfils in the third round of the Indian Wells yesterday, while Rafael Nadal remains unbeaten against Britain's Daniel Evans. Monfils won the first tour games of the final set, and Medvedev was unable to set up a single break point opportunity. It was the first time in 13 years that the 35-year-old Monfils beat the number one ranked player in the world. And from that, onto some news in Paralympics. Sunday's closing ceremony of the Beijing Winter Paralympics showed China's advanced science and technology, highlighting message of inclusion, resilience, and hope to people with disabilities. Over 9 days, Beijing, the first city ever to have hosted both the Summer and the Winter Paralympic Games, witnessed remarkable feats of para athletes from around the world. And here's what's trending on Twitter today. Twitter users shows outpour of condolence over the death of the legendary WWE wrestler Scott Hall. He was just 63. And on a lighter note, nasi lemak is trending this time as it's listed in the list ranking. South Asian food is calling the dish okay with a score of only 3.9, sparking up, as you guessed it, a lot of discussion online among passionate Malaysians defending our national beloved dish. Of course, the hashtags to look out for hashtag nasi lemak and hashtag Scott Hall. Well, it's time to wrap up this edition of The Brief. Today, of course, a quick reminder is World Consumer Rights Day. Know your right as a consumer. Till I see you next time, take care. Bye bye.